Okay, so let's talk about some politics now. So this week is obviously a unique week, right? This only happens every so often, right? Usually when there's a transition from one president to the other. So this basically dominated the week. Now Biden has this period of time, this we call this a honeymoon period, the first 100 days, where he's able to enact legislation much easier. In part because he's kind of an unknown. People give him a bit of a leeway, the public and Congress, about getting his agenda agenda started, right? This is and so he's trying to act very fast. He knows this. He worked in Congress for many years, but decades, and so as did Harris. Well, Harris for much less time, but he knows he has this very finite amount of time, and he's going to make good use of that. Trump squandered his, and I think that's a pretty legitimate criticism of him, is that his rhetoric really pushed people away from him, and immediately he was able, immediate opposition to him. If he had, I thought, one thing about political science is that it's pretty poor or pretty terrible at making predictions because people have agency. And I think I said this over and over again in lectures, but I predicted, and I was wrong. I'll admit when I'm wrong. That I thought Trump would I thought he would uh, his rhetoric was to get elected, and then once he entered office, he would change his rhetoric to be much more moderate. He never did so, and we'll talk a little bit about that throughout the course. A lot of this, I think, Trump's explanation for why he behaved the way he did was comes down to some psychological understandings of him, and he's really pushed to appeal to his base. Anyways, so let's first talk about Trump. Trump left office. He issued a bunch of executive orders up until the last minute. Many of those orders will be undone. One of the big criticisms people have of the Trump administration, at least I would make of him, again, this is not in terms of substance, but it's in terms of strategy, is that he basically tried to enact most of his policies through executive order, and so did Obama. Now, both of them would make the argument that they did so because they had a hostile Congress. That's true. I'm not trying to discount that too much, but that's kind of a terrible argument, in my opinion. If you have a hostile Congress, your job as president is to convince them of your policies. Sucks to be you if you have a hostile Congress. I don't see why that's, like, oh no, they're going against me. Well, that's kind of way the system is designed. So your job is to pass legislation then that accommodates both parties. Trump couldn't do that. He refused to do that. Obama, to a lesser extent, refused to do that. And my point, when Obama recently argued about getting rid of the filibuster because he couldn't pass his policy, well, that's a terrible idea. You're an idiot. Don't do that. We shouldn't be doing that for a variety of different reasons. It has terrible consequences. But but he should have done a better job of courting Congress. And so the same applies to Donald Trump. He can complain all he wants about the swamp or the deep state, whatever he wants to call those conspiratorial terms, but it comes down to his inability to actually convince Congress of what his policies the benefit of his policies, right? So I'm pretty critical of both Obama and Trump for this way approaching the presidency. I think over the summer, I think I called them both idiots in the same lecture, which made me happy. I'm not going to pull punches when it comes to things like that. Now, the filibuster is something we'll talk about quite a bit. I am not a fan of getting rid of it for a variety of different reasons, mostly because it eliminates the voice of the minority. And there are problems with the filibuster, don't get me wrong, but getting rid of it outright is just silly and wrong and stupid. Okay, let's move on to pardons. Trump did a lot of pardons. I think the last day of office, a lot of celebrities, a lot of people who be kind of surprising. I think Trump just kind of did whoever he thought he could get. Pardons are an interesting thing for the presidency, and all presidents have done pardons. They all do it near the end of their office, the time in office. They're always controversial ones. Trump did a lot of controversial ones. And I think what was surprising is I kind of gave it a 50 shot on whether he pardoned the Capitol rioters. and he didn't. And I thought that was quite interesting. I think he bears a lot of responsibility for inciting them, and I think it's kind of in poor form, or to put it nicely, that he didn't, at least help them out a little bit. I mean, he duped them, and they're the ones that are going to pay the cost for that, and very real cost for that. It's quite sad, actually. These individuals. I mean, there's two ways to look at it. These are just malcontents who rioted, or those people who were duped. I think they're both true, but at the same time, it's you know uh, these people who thought Trump really did get cheated out of the election. Um, they're acting what they think is the right thing to do, and all of a sudden their world comes crashing down because they're on a false assumption, and now they're going to pay real consequences, time in prison and whatnot. And one of them is dead, and I think there's real that is a normatively, morally bad position Trump put them in. Okay, which leads me to my next point about impeachment. Trump will be impeached. He has been impeached actually for a second time. He's very unique. Whether the trial can go forward or not is up in the air, and I think it will absolutely will go forward. And Trump's argument or his defense will probably be, well, I'm not president anymore. It's like I can't be thrown out. I can't be impeached because I'm no longer president. That's a okay argument. I think it's a very strong argument. Nevertheless, I think that um, I don't know the constitutionality of it. It hasn't been decided yet. I think eventually he probably will take that to the court system, but it's going to be an interesting trial. Now there is some buy-in from the GOP, the Republicans, and they're probably going to back this to some degree. Whether or not they get a conviction, that's up in the air. Part of the problem is that they're pushing this back till February, and that gives a lot of space between what happened on January 6th to now. And that's it could be that people start to forget and people move on. Probably not. The other issue with this is whether or not they're going to disbar him from being able to be elected to office again. That is within their ability, and I think they absolutely will do that at some level. I think the Republicans have a vested interest in doing so because of his looming presence in the party. Now, the other issue I'll talk about is the senators and Congress people who back Trump. There's been a move to censure them, and I would argue that is inappropriate. I think that the problem with this is that they have a right to their voice and a right to their opinion, and they weren't the ones on Capitol Hill on the mall inciting people. They had their voice, their opinion, and their consequence of that will be decided at the ballot box. Um, Other people, Democrats, have raised objections to elections in the past. I don't see any problem with them doing so. That's the role of Congress. The idea that they have the ability to raise objections and debate this. To do so, to censure them for doing so, is completely inappropriate. Um, and so I have a real problem with them doing that. There is a process, and we have to abide by that process. And just because you don't like the process, it doesn't mean you could censure them at will, right? And so moving on, there is, I mean, piggybacking on that, there is this looming presence of Trump in the GOP. What's his role going to be? And in the same vein as the censure, several state Republican parties have censured those like Liz Cheney and those Congress people who have voted for impeachment, and they censured them, saying no, you shouldn't have done that. Censure is like an admonishment, and that's again inappropriate. They have the ability to do so. So I'm both critical of the Democrats for recommending censure within Congress, and I'm extremely critical of the Republicans state parties for censoring the people who voted for impeachment. And so they're both wrong, in my opinion. I'm just quite critical of that. Again, whether or not Trump should or should not be impeached, that's irrelevant. the point about is process and people having the ability to voice their opinions. And if you start diminishing that, then I have a problem with that. But Trump will be a looming presence in the GOP for some time to come. There's no doubt about that. And how much that's going to remain to be seen. I think the GOP the Republican Party would do well for itself to move on. I don't see much meaning benefit from what from holding on to Trumpism. And that's not a criticism of Trumpism. It's just that he's no longer in office, and I don't know what they seek to gain by it. He lost an election, in large part because of his rhetoric, and I don't see how moving forward that's going to help them. The And so the other issue is that it is divisive within the party, and yeah, I just don't see for them helping them to cling on onto that. I think they should move forward and reinvent the party at some level. But what do I know? Okay, so but anyways, Trump will loom long for some time to come. And Trump's talked about forming another party and whatnot. I don't foresee that actually happening and being fruitful at all. And third parties don't really go anywhere. We'll talk about third parties in a couple lectures, but yeah. Anyways, so Biden takes office now. So what Biden does is that he undoes a lot of what Trump did, right? Through executive order, right? And again, this is the fundamental problem with legislating through executive order or doing policy through executive order. The next guy can just undo it. So what's the point of doing it? And so it doesn't have any permanence, right? So Biden, he suspends the Keystone XL pipeline, right, which Trump gave a permit to. He put a 60-day moratorium on mining minerals or gas on federal lands. He rejoined the Paris Climate Accord. He's probably going to try to rejoin the Iran nuclear talks. He rejoined the WHO, right? The WHO is most critical of Trump for pulling out of. His arguments were relatively poor, and there's a lot of utility in joining that and being part of that. The Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal are much more in lines in terms of your own perspective and policy, in terms of ideological perspective. Is it good that he joined the Paris Climate Accord? It depends. Or rejoined it, or Trump pulled out and Biden joined it. It's neither good nor bad. It just is, and it depends on your perspective. The Iran nuclear deal, it's neither good nor bad. Again, it depends on your perspective. Trump was an isolationist, and that's a theoretical approach to international relations, or an ideological approach to international relations. That he wanted to disengage from the international world. Biden is not that. Biden is much more of an interventionist. I mean, he's kind of a foreign relations wonk. He's done a lot of work there, and so I think you're gonna have a very different approach by Biden. And is isolationism wrong? No, it's not wrong. It's just different, right? And so Trump did some interesting things in the international relations sphere. Not all of them good, not all of them bad, right? And so I think we have to be honest in terms of what that means. But the WHO pulling out of that I was most critical of, because WHO, the World Health Organization, does a lot of coordination for things like COVID, and Trump's argument was something to the effect that the Chinese had too much influence. That very well might be, but pulling out of it does nothing to help us. And so, anyways, so you'll see a much different approach to international relations by Biden. Now, is that good or is that bad? Neither. Again, it depends on your perspective, but it will have different consequences. Absolutely. The next thing that Biden rolled out was COVID response, right? So vaccine, how to deal with that. Basically, he exercised every tool he could. And the Trump administration's approach to COVID was much more hands-off. And COVID was the response to COVID, and I guess the lack of coordination was really a consequence of federalism. Now, the federal government doesn't have a lot of levers to pull in terms of forcing states to do things, but they can do things like mask mandates on airlines because they travel between state lines, federal parks, money, and the National Defense Procurement Act. Those are things that they could do, and I think which Biden did. I think Trump's reticent to do so was twofold. One was an ideological, not to have this overarching federal government. Second was that I think Trump just hoped it'd go away. That, and I think the Trump administration's response to it was haphazard. Now, it's easy to Monday morning quarterback, but you know, the advantage of the federal government response to COVID or any national disaster is that they can have coordination. It's one voice rather than 50 state voices, and they can really create best practices, directives and whatnot that can help guide the states. Because there was this haphazard rollout of these policies, it really didn't happen. So there's a pretty valid criticism of the Trump administration. That being said, the extent to how bad this was going to be wasn't really known, and so it's really hard. It's easy to criticize, but I think it's also important to temper that with understanding what we knew at the time. I mean, if you look back at my weekly recaps back in December of last year and into January, I kind of talked, well, this COVID thing it's something we should look at. It might happen. Oh, it might be only a few months, and I was wrong, right? And I think we all were wrong, right? We all wouldn't expect that a year later, almost a year later, we still be in the midst of this actually in a really bad situation. The other thing the other executive orders that Biden introduced were on terms of immigration. He reversed Trump's travel ban, which is not surprising, and he strengthened DACA. The travel ban was Trump's kind of response to the perception that there was bad actors coming into the country to do violence, and there was a lot of violence by ISIS at the time, and so they're all domestically born, but nevertheless, this was the fear that he had, and he instituted this travel ban. And the other one was DACA. Biden strengthening DACA. Now, DACA is not safe. The Trump administration tried to rescind DACA, and they did a terrible job at doing that because they just tried to do it without any justification. And there is a good justification for ending it. The way DACA was passed was exceeded the authority of the presidency, essentially, would be my argument. And so when the Trump administration tried to undo it, that paused several lawsuits that were poised to stop DACA. Those lawsuits are now moving forward, and so DACA is far from safe. And so so I think Biden's going to strengthen it and hope that legislation passes to then actually legislate DACA. DACA, I mean, I'll be blunt with you, is a gross abuse of presidential power. The Obama administration had no authority to actually create this, yet he created this program. And, that's not to say that DACA is not a good or bad program. It's just the way that it was passed was inappropriate. Which I talked about this before in, I think, lecture 2. I'll talk about this in lecture 2. The next piece is impeachment. The Biden administration it's a complicated thing for the Biden administration because while there might be a moral or normative push to want to impeach Donald Trump, it's a distraction. And Biden has other things he would rather do than deal with an impeachment. It's going to take up the Senate's time, which he needs. And so for him, this is a big impediment, and he'd rather just move on. And I think the other problem with this is it's divisive. Trump has a lot of supporters. Trump had a lot of votes. Not all of them still support him, but there's a lot of people who really support Donald Trump, and so the country's quite divided. So an impeachment trial could be very divisive, and Biden's trying really hard not to be divisive. And so this is kind of he might acknowledge the need for it at some level, but this is really an impediment to him. Other areas that have had severe conflict between peoples in the country, civil conflict. Thinking like South Africa, Rwanda, places. I mean, I'm not saying the level of our conflict is to that level, but there's this idea of lustration. How do you deal with justice after the fact? And oftentimes the argument people make is that just move on. The idea going back and getting true justice isn't always useful because it creates divisiveness. Now, I'm not saying that's what we should do, but it is an issue, right? How do you deal with this? And I think the Biden administration, for Biden, he's like, either get it over with fast or move on. In terms of legislation for Biden, he has a massive stimulus he wants to pass. Janet Yellen's heading that up. He wants to pass the Green New Deal, voting rights, which is going to be difficult for him to pass. He wants to do a complete voting reform. Democrats are pushing that. It's going to be difficult for them to do that, however. And lastly, immigration reform. He wants a pathway to citizenship for several groups of undocumented or illegal immigrants. That's going to be difficult to pass, right? And not all of these he's going to get. He has a very the slimmest majority you can have in the Senate, and he's going to have to temper his expectations. The last thing, I'm going fast because I'm running out of time. I'm actually over time. Is extremism. And this is where I'm going to get uncomfortable in terms of how we talk about this. And the problem I have when we look at domestic extremism is that you're looking at ideology. And how do we define extremism? What is extremism? And that becomes then, if we define it too broadly, what does that look like? And can that be abused? And then I get really uncomfortable with that. And I think about this after 9/11. If you're a Muslim after 9/11, there's probably this distinct fear that because you're a Muslim, you're going to be looked at and monitored, and the government would take abuses against you. That's a fairly real criticism, real fear, and it did happen. The New York City was monitoring mosque and keeping track of people in mosque. That's a pretty gross abuse of power. And the same could be applied here. How are we going to treat extremism? How do we define extremism, right? How do we define, are we going to do purges of the government because based upon someone's ideological perspective? Is this going to be applied to the same to the left and the right? I can become extremely uncomfortable when we talk about ideology in terms of a policy and a way of monitoring and whatnot. Obviously, when it comes to violent conflict, people have taken arms against the government illegitimately, then that's a problem. I'm not trying to deny that. At the same time, when you start looking at people's ideology and calling it extreme, what does that look like? And I get really uncomfortable with that. Martin Luther King Jr. was an extremist in the 60s, so was Malcolm X, right? And okay, Margaret Sanger, right? All these different people who we now enshrine as in good policies were all extremists, right? I mean, they fought the system, and so we have to be very careful how we define this and how we look into this, and so I'm uncomfortable with that rhetoric, right? And so then again we also have people raid Congress, right? And how do we define those people? Are they insurgents? Are they terrorists? Are they are they insurrectionists? Right? Are they protesters? Are they to some patriots? Right? It's an interesting debate how we define people, and I'm uncomfortable with that. Oftentimes in international relations, we just say that's terrorism. Terrorism has this very visceral connotation, and I'm not sure what we should call these people right now. Fooled is one of them, is what I call them. But I'm uncomfortable. I don't know. If you look at the definition of domestic terrorism, the definition can also fit many other groups of people, can fit other instances. And I'm not sure if that fits, right? I'm not sure if just throwing the term terrorism or insurrection around is appropriate. I think one of my concerns would be organization. One of them being, is there an organization? Is it a durable movement? You look at what's the difference between a protest versus an insurrection? That's something we should. I guess I don't know the answer. I don't think we have a good answer for that right now. And so I think we have to be very careful how we define things. If you look at the protest, the rhetoric surrounding the protest by the right wing, and over the summer, with the George Floyd killings, they use the same type of rhetoric. And it's I say that's inappropriate rhetoric, because are they? I think the right called them anarchist and they called them insurrectionists. They called them terrorism, right? Not completely inappropriate, right? And so how we define people, how we label people in terms of this is very important. And so analytically, I just don't know at this point. And I think we have to be very careful how we define what we mean by extremism or whatnot. And so, I just I'm uneasy with the government looking at ideology as a way of looking at for security matters. So that's it for this week. Hopefully I didn't offend. Hopefully I either offended everyone or I only didn't offend that many of you. So thank you all. I'm gonna lower time this week. I apologize. I'll talk to you all next week. Thank you.